They came back to 770. It was late. It was a very short day. It was like now. It was a very short day. It wasn't the shortest days of the year, but what time is Lich Bench Shabbos? 4:45. It's very early. And of course, one of the things that's very important by Shiva is you want to start Shiva that day. Shiva is 7 days. Shiva is 7 days from when you sit down, not from the Levaya, that when the person passes away. If a person passes away on Monday and you bury them on Thursday and they start Shiva on Sunday, Shiva goes till Shabbos. And you don't want to postpone Avelis. So it's very important when you have a Levaya, if you've ever been in a Levaya that are very late in the day, they'll actually ask the Avelim to sit down Shiva in the cemetery. Sit just for a minute. So because you shouldn't lose a day, you understand? They ran back to 770, it was Rai Mamish Lichtmention time, they sat Shiva. So that the first day, that Sunday was one of the days of Shiva, and of course they went till Shabbos morning. In other words, when you get up on Shabbos, you don't really get up. You just stop Avelis, because Shabbos there's no Avelis before Hesia. The Rebbe came back to 770, Daven Mincha. The Rebbe went into his room, and he left his door open. The Rebbe had torn Kriya. We all tore Kriya. He left his door open because he wanted the Bacham to see that he sat down on a low stool. The Rebbe was not an oval. Remember, the Rebbe was not an oval. The Rebbe was the son-in-law, not a son. There were no sons. So the Avelim were the Rebbe Tzedakah Medina and the Rebbe Tzedakah Bushka and her sister, Chana. The Rebbe was not an oval. But by a Rebbe, everyone, we all sat Shiva for a little bit. The Rebbe sat on a low stool for a half an hour, and he wanted that the Bacham should see that he's sitting Shiva. So they should imitate. They should do what he's doing, you understand? The Bacham were in 770 and they saw the Rebash, as he was called then, sitting on a low stool. So they all took, the same thing you do Tisha B'Av. They lowered the benches, they sat on a low stool, just for half an hour. The Rebbe wore the kapota that he tore. He wore the whole week of Shiva. He wore the torn Bekesha the whole week, even though it was not a novel. But he sat on a regular chair. He didn't do Avelis. He didn't have Navachs of Avelis. And they organized minyanim. There were 2 minyanim. The Rashag was older. The first minyan was the Rashag, and the second minyan was the Rebbe. And right away, people began to choose favorites. Which minyan do you want to be in? Who's your guy? So the Rashag had his people, and the Rebbe had his people. The Rashag had the first minyan, the Rebbe had the second minyan. And the fact of life is, it didn't take very long for it to resolve itself. I mean, the Chassidim all figured out what the deal was. Most people knew already. I mean, most people had enough seichel to understand that I'm coming to the second minyan, The Rashag, I'm sure he had a minyan, probably had a big minyan, but within weeks or even days, it became very disparate. The Rashag's minyan was Nebuch, and the Rebbe's minyan there was no room to get in. They davened in the Friedrich Rebbe's Cheder the whole year. The Rashag had the first minyan, the Rebbe had the second minyan. Shabbos, I think they davened downstairs. The Shabbos davened in Shul. But the Shtasa Avelis, I think they davened upstairs. The Rashag had the first minyan and the Rebbe had the second minyan. Tuesday morning. This was Sunday, right? You Yud with Shabbos. Sunday morning, Tuesday morning, the Rebbe davens Shachris, and he turns around after davening and he says that the Gemara said, Shloisha lebchi. So Tuesday morning, Yud Gimel Shvat, the Rebbe turns around and he says that the Gemara says, Shloisha lebchi v'shiva lehesped. For 3 days you cry, and 7 days you eulogize. You say a hesped. And the Rebbe says, in Chabad we don't make hespedim. Chabad doesn't make hespedim. So I'm going to tell stories of the Friedrich Rebbe, and this will be in lieu of a hesped. Those stories are in Likutei Sichos. The Rebbe looked over those stories in Likutei Sichos, Chelik Beis, and the Yisafis in Yud Shvat. And the Rebbe told stories. Azam Maisa. There was a Yid here from England. His name was Rabbi Yitzchok Dubov Oliver Shalom. He lived in Manchester, England. He came here for a wedding. His son got married Thursday night. Ches Shvat. Son got married Ches Shvat. When the Friedrich passed away, he asked the Rebbe what he should do. The Rebbe said, go to Borough Park, make Sheva Brachas, do not go to Levaya. He was a chassan. Shiva Simchat Simcha is not allowed to be Avelis. The Rebbe told him to go to Borough Park and to do the Sheva Brachas. But his father, Rabbi Dubov, was at the Levaya. He was by the Rebbe's minyan. Rabbi Dubov knew the Rebbe from 1928, from Riga. I have a niece who's a Dubov from home. And she told me that Rabbi Dubov had a shul in Riga. When the Friedrich Rebbe left Russia, he needed a shul. So Rabbi Dubov gave him his shul with his Kehilim, the Gans and Mises. He gave him away his minyan. Rabbi Dubov had a job. He was the Rebbe of a shul. He gave the Rebbe his shul. So he didn't have a job. He looked for a new job. Where did he find a job? In England. And it saved his life. Had he stayed in Riga, he would have been killed by the Nazis. He gave the Rebbe his shul. Finished. He gave the Rebbe his shul. He knew the Rebbe from then. And he knew that the Rebbe is something like out of this world. both in terms of godless in Torah, and his godless in Chassidus, and his godless in his kashrus. People who, the Rebbe was a very secret man, but people who knew him, they all knew how great a Gaon he was. They knew how big a Yirei Shamayim, how tzniistic he was. But above all else, he worshipped every single motion of the Frierdiker Rebbe was by him the most precious thing in the world. And people knew this. People knew how much the Rebbe was in awe of the Frierdiker Rebbe. And that was really the biggest thing. Rabbi Duba was there. And when the Rebbe davened for the Yom, there were things the Rebbe did that he didn't understand. L'moshel. The Rebbe didn't do Slach Lanu. He didn't bank Slach Lanu. Did this. So after that Tuesday morning, the Rebbe says, one of the stories he said was that the Frierdiker Rebbe told him that when you're in a house where you don't say Tachman, you don't clap Slach Lanu, and others don't say Tachman. So he realized the Rebbe is hearing his thoughts, and the Rebbe should answer his questions. Another thing was that before the Rebbe said Kaddish D'Rabbanan, the Rebbe did like this with his finger. He was thinking, why is the Rebbe doing it? So after davening, the Rebbe answered his questions without him even asking. And the Rebbe said that the Rebbe the Shver told him that when you say Mishnayos, so after you say Reb Chanan ben Akasha, you should say a couple of lines of Tanya. And the Rebbe used to run his hand and go first. So Rabbi Dubov saw B'muchesh, Poshet Ruach HaKodesh, he would think a question, and the Rebbe answered him. That day, that Tuesday, Yud Gimel Shvat, the middle of Shiva, the Rebbe went for the first time to the Tzion of the Frierdiker Rebbe, the first of thousands of times. The Frierdiker Rebbe's oil. There wasn't an oil, there wasn't a matzeh, it was a mountain of earth. There's actually pictures of the Rebbe standing by the Frierdiker Rebbe, and there's just a mound. You can get pictures, online you can get pictures. I have the pictures in my collection. So they went to the oil, Tuesday, the middle of Shiva, the Rebbe stood there for a long time doing whatever he had to do. And when the Rebbe was about to walk away, Rabbi Yitzchak Dubov walked to the Rebbe, the first person who did this. And he says to the Rebbe, until now was the Rebbe, and now is you. He told the Rebbe 3 days after the Frierdiker Rebbe passed away, until now is the Rebbe, now it's you. The Rebbe got very upset, and he snapped back. The Rebbe leapt. The Rebbe's alive. Don't even think, the Rebbe's alive. The Rebbe's alive, don't even think it. The Rebbe's alive. My Zaydi Shustaman, all of my grandfather Shustaman. My Zaydi Shustaman told me that during the Levaya, he was in 770, and the Rebbe was running up and down the steps, and the Rebbe sees him. My Zaydi Shustaman was the typesetter. He typed up the Basi Lagani. And he only typed up half. There was another half that still needed to be typed. The Rebbe sees him, the Rebbe turns to him and says to my grandfather, you have to stop typesetting, because now that the Rebbe passed away, we have no hira to print anymore. Stop. My grandfather was planning to continue typing, so he stopped. During the week of Shiva, the Rebbe turns to my grandfather a second time with a smile. He says, "Nu, we have to think about continuing to print." So my grandfather told us, I had a Rebbe right away. The Rebbe told him to stop and to start. One that sees was within a week. He told him before the Levaya on Sunday morning to stop. By the end of the week, the Rebbe told him, "Nu," with a smile, "Nu." So my grandfather Shustaman told me, for him there was already a Rebbe. It didn't take a week. That smile was, in other words, when there's a transference from Rebbe to Rebbe, you stop and you start again. With a stop, oh, enough of this nice. That's how he felt. The Rebbe was already his Rebbe before the Shiva was up. And of course, then started the whole deal that you all know, the whole Arichas HaParsha, and the clock has no heart, about succession. So first of all, some people were more inclined to the Rashag, but most people who knew the Rebbe were more inclined to the Rebbe. Finish, don't let me disturb you. Finish. Overseas, people, my father told me, he was in France. Most of the Lubavitchers were in France then. After the Frierdiker passed away, he remembers that Sunday, they all got together. The mood was terrible. The Chassidim were zerbrochen. Reb Yankel Shveit hat mir gesagt, Yankel Shveit told me, Reb Nissen, Nemenov, fell on the ground. They had a Fabrengen. They got together Sunday, Yud Aleph Shvat, for a Askara to talk about the Frierdiker Rebbe. He said he fell on the ground. And he told me he never got up. When Reb Nissen stood up, he wasn't that same man. The Frierdiker Rebbe passed away, he fell down. He said he watched it happen. Reb Nissen was such a strong man. He fell down. The person that got up was not the same man who fell. He was never the same again. He told me he lost something. He was so broad. He lost something. And even though he stood up, he lived another 30-something years. He says that the Reb Nissen that fell down on that Sunday, Year of Shvat, never got up. So my father told me that in the beginning, they were talking about the Rashag. And after like a few years, all of a sudden, started saying, Ramash. He remembers the first pictures of the Rebbe that arrived. Such a young man. Huh? The Rebbe was 48, but he looked like he was 20. His beard was so black and so neatly tucked in. And slowly the wave started to turn from Rashag towards Ramash, and then within months everybody understood that there really no two candidates. But some of the more initial things that happened was, people came to the Rebbe with questions. And they said to the Rebbe, we used to ask the Frierdiker Rebbe, what should we do now? So I'll tell you some of the famous stories that are known. One of the famous stories is Yechen and Gordon, Alav Shalom. Yechen and Gordon had a question. He was the Gabbai of 770. So he went over to the Rebbe and he says, an address. There was an address who to ask, what should we do now? So the Rebbe said to him, go to the El and ask. So he told the Rebbe, I can go to the El and ask, but I'm not going to get any answers. I don't know what to do. I need to have a practical question. So he said, you don't have an answer? I'll bring you the answer. You go, I'll bring you. In other words, from the first minute, the Rebbe never denied that him and the Frierdiker Rebbe are in conversation, just like I'm talking to you. But that's not a Rebbe. Just he happens to know how to communicate with someone who's in this mind of the matzv. So the Rebbe told people, go to the oil. You can't get an answer? I'll get to the answer. I heard that the Rashag came to the Rebbe. He said, what do I do? And the Rebbe said, go to the oil. He says, I can go to the oil, but I don't hear the answer. He says, I'll get you the answer. As far as the Rebbe was concerned, that has nothing to do with being a Rebbe. Just what's the difference? What's the difference? Like this. You go to the Rebbe here, you go to the Rebbe here, you get an answer. That's how it was. So the Lashon was, this was the word, that Yechen said to the Rebbe, I need an answer. So the Rebbe told him to go upstairs. Go into Frierdiker Rebbe's room and ask by the table. So he said to the Rebbe, Mizanenishkin Umaner. You know what's Umaner? The Breslev Rebbe is in Uman. Mizanishkin Umaner, a Rebbe that's deceased. We have a Lebedike Rebbe, Nishkan Umaner. That was the word. Another story which was revealed by Leibel Groner in Nundalit was, there was Shia Hecht. You ever heard of the Hecht brothers? Yeah, their father gets in Shia. Rebbe Shia Hecht. Havrav Rebbe Shia Hecht. Shia Hecht did not have a beard. He was a clean-shaven man. But he was a very Chassidish Yid. Look at his kids. His kids were giants. So he came into the Rebbe, and he said to the Rebbe, what should I do? I have a question. So the Rebbe said to him, do what I do. Go upstairs. He was one of those people, he got it whenever he wanted. He was a big miyuchas. Go into Frierdiker Rebbe's room and stand by the table and ask. So he told the Rabbi, he says, I'm a Jew from Galicia. In Galicia, we knew a mencha Rebbe, nicht a benkel Rebbe. We need a Rebbe that's a boss of a dom, not a chair. I need a Rebbe that can touch. So the Rebbe had no choice but to be a Rebbe, a boss of a dom. So it started slowly, understand? I told you before they had two minyanim. The first minyan was the Rebbe, the first one was the Rashag. The Rashag was older. Second minyan was the Rebbe. It went a whole year. And people started to align themselves with their parties, you understand? In New York, it was very messy. Away from New York, it was a little bit easier and clearer. But here, it was very difficult. Again, my father was 12 when this happened, and he was living in France. So I obviously don't remember this. I wasn't born. But what you hear from people was in New York, it was very uncomfortable. So there were different stages. Stage number one was, the Rebbe had many friends. Rebbe was a nice man. Pusher was a nice guy. Very busy, very calculated, very deliberate, but very nice. And the Rebbe used to shake people's hands. He used to Shalom Aleichem. So there became a category of Hasidim who wouldn't shake the Rebbe's hand. Right away. Rabbi Gringlas, Berel Baumgarten, Rabbi Chadekov. As soon as the Frierdiker passed away, there were people who knew right away, this is it. They had no questions. So the Rebbe would put, you know how comfortable it is? Imagine, the Rebbe sees you on the street and puts his hand out and you don't want to shake it. It's very uncomfortable. It's very uncomfortable. So the first couple of times it happened, the Rebbe must have felt, shake my hand. I'm sorry, I'm not shaking your hand. I don't like you anymore, A Rebbe, in Chabad, you don't shake a Rebbe's hand. In the Polish Chassidus, shaking the Rebbe's hand is a big part of the Chassidus. It's called Gevim Shalom. In Chabad, you don't touch a Rebbe. So the Rebbe labeled them Akshonim. The people who refused to shake his hand were called the Akshonim. So Berel Baumgart meets the Rebbe puts his hand out and he refuses to shake it. Oh, you're also from the Akshonim, That was stage one, the Akshonim, Stubborn ones. Akshonim, the stubborn ones. I heard from a Yid, heard from Jacobson Shalom, that in the very, very beginning, when they suggested to the Rebbe being a Rebbe, the Rebbe said, if you don't leave me alone, I'm going to run away from New York and I'm going to hide and you'll never find me. The Rebbe said, if you don't leave, the very beginning, if you don't leave me alone, I'm going to run away from New York and I'm going to hide and you're never going to find me. And I want you to understand that Chassidim knew that that's possible. The Rebbe was a serious guy. He didn't mess around. And when he made that threat, they were so afraid. They were partially afraid that should happen. Ad kedei kach, Anyway, that was the first salvo, the first step. But slowly it changed. One of the things which happened pretty early on was there was chassid in Etzisol named Avram Paris, a very, very, very big chassid. And a Meshuggah Mekusha. He's a radical Meshuggah Mekusha. So Shabbos, the Friedrich passed away Shabbos. So Matzah Shabbos, they made an announcement. All the Lubavitchers who lived in Kfar Chabad, or lived in Yerushalayim, or lived in Tel Aviv, came to the Lubavitch show in Tel Aviv for an Askara. It wasn't a very large room, it was packed. And there were some very prominent people there. Rabbi Zevin, Rabbi Gershon Chaim, Rabbi Shnei Derov, Rabbi Shmuel Batumer, big Talmidei Chachamim, old Lubavitch Chassidim, Mamish Go'onim, who were there. And they all spoke. And of course their speech was about one thing, that the work of the Friedrich Rebbe has to continue, and that we have to support the Moises. All of them were broke. They were Russian Jews who just came from Europe. But nevertheless, they should support the Rebbe's work and so on. When the official part of the ceremony was over, Avram Paris went over to the mic, and he picked up the mic. This is Sunday Yud Al Shvat. He says, Rabbi, say I have an announcement to make. You should know we have a Rebbe. And his name is Kach V'Kach. He said the Rebbe's name. He said, I lived in New York for 9 years. And I worked in the same office with the Rebbe. He says, I used to sit in that office for hours and not do a stitch of work. I would sit and stare at him. You should know he's a ganev. That was his expression. He's a ganev. He tries to act like a regular person. He keeps a newspaper in his pocket. The newspaper was 5 years old. They were always working on a newspaper. He says, he went on and on, he described the Rebbe to the Chassidim. And he said, we're going to write the Ksav Eskashis today, the day after the Histalkus. And a lot of Chassidim signed, including Grois Chassidim. Avram Chaim Noah signed. The day after the Histalkus. And I don't know whose idea it was, but they wrote in that Ksav Eskashis, Melech HaMashiach. The day after the Friedrich Rebbe passed away, they wrote a Ksav Eskashis, and a lot of Chassidim signed, they sent it to New York. So the Rebbe got a letter from this Avram Paris. He was such a chassid. He was such a chassid, the Friedrich Rebbe, and such a chassid of the Rebbe's. In the letter, he refers to our Rebbe as the Rebbe Shlita. It was mamish weeks after the Friedrich Rebbe passed away. He refers to our Rebbe as the Rebbe Shlita. So two things happened. The Rebbe went into the office to get the mail. The mosquitoes, when Chada goes off, went to the office to get the mail. He sifts through the mail, opens up this letter, he starts to read it. Then he turns to Chadakov, the cook, I'm Meshuggah. Schreibt Mem the Rebbe said his name. Mem Shneir Sana Rebbe. Look, he writes Mem Shneir Sana Rebbe. So Chadakov turns around to the Rebbe. You guys don't remember Chadakov. I barely remember him. He had a German Yiddish. And he was a very precise man. He was a real Yakke. Chadakov tells the Rebbe, Ich halt ochazo. Ich halt ochazo. I agree with him. So the Rebbe says, B'steichet ha-Meshuggah. So you're also crazy. This is how it was in the very beginning. It was so mufrech to the Rebbe to be a Rebbe. But Chassidim slowly, broke the ice. They pushed it through. They got the Rebbe to think about it and to hear about it. And it took months for the idea to become more and more comfortable. There's a lot of stages to this story. I guess I'll finish with this. But the one thing that I want to add is that Chassidim kept coming to the Rebbe and asking him why he doesn't want to be a Rebbe. And he said, because the Friedrich Rebbe never told me to do it. So Lag BaOmer, which was 3 months after the Histalkus, 10 Chassidim got into a car, or a couple of cars. They drove to the oil, and they told the Friedrich Rebbe that the Rebbe keeps on saying that he has no Hira, and they're asking the Friedrich Rebbe to tell the Rebbe Shema Kabbalah Hanesius. That date, the Rebbe was by the oil, our Rebbe was by the oil, and he came back from the oil. He didn't say anything to anybody, but he never ever used that excuse again. The excuse, he gave other excuses, but the excuse, he never repeated it again. Okay, good Shabbos, Kinder. Good Shabbos. I'll see you, mate.